Some days I feel not like I'm living life, but like life's living me. There is so much to do, and I feel like so often I get to the end of my day and I haven't finished half of the things that I really hope to and set out to do in my day. I don't know if I'm the only one who feels that way. It reminds me of the expression, if you don't know where you're going, then every path will lead you there. And so I want to talk about this idea of sort of beginning with the end in mind. When any of the ministers here officiate a wedding ceremony, we begin at the end. When we're not when we officiate, when we do the rehearsal, excuse me. We begin at the end. And sometimes people are confused. Why are we starting at the end? Shouldn't we process in? Isn't that where it begins? And we say, well, you can't process in if you don't know where you're going to stand. Right? So we get everybody in place where they're going to be, and then we do the recessional first. And then they know where they're coming. And then we start again from the beginning, and everybody knows where they're supposed to be. And it's this idea of beginning with the end in mind. Our youth group, our seniors in our youth group go on a spirit quest every year. They're going to be going later this month, the seniors, and they go out, they do some rock climbing, and they go down into a cave, into the belly of the earth, and they do this amazing, challenging adventure together, and with wrestling with themselves and their own self-confidence in the process. It's amazing, something that Kate Starr, our phenomenal youth director, started some years ago. And on that trip, they use a story about death. Because even though these young people are seniors in high school and they're about to sort of finish high school and go into have their whole life in front of them, the idea is that if we can get them thinking about the end, it will give them the tools that they need to live their life from this point forward, knowing where they want to go. The story that Kate uses for this adventure, she spreads it over 3 days. And this story is also from India. And it's about a young man called Nachiketa. And Nachiketa is someone who looked death in the eyes. He was someone who was the son of a very wealthy merchant in India. And he had gone to a couple of funerals just recently, at this point when he was a young adult, and he started to realize the shallowness of material things, especially when they're separated from any sort of sense of spiritual things. And so, even though he was from a very wealthy family, it started him on a spiritual search. Well, especially, it came to a head when his father went before the temple, and the Brahmin priest of the Hindu temple in India asked his father to give many of his possessions. He gave a grand donation to the temple in order to ensure a good rebirth in the afterlife. And so he gave gold and cattle, and it was in a very public setting there in the temple. And Nachiketa was appalled that merit was something that could be purchased. And when his father, standing before the throngs in the temple, said, "I give you all of what's most valuable to me," his son stood there and said, "What about me? Am I not valuable?" Well, this shamed his father in front of everybody. And his father was enraged that his son would do that at this high point moment for him in his life, in front of all the people that he respected the most. So he said to his son, "I give you unto death. You too." And his son said, "Well, then I accept." And he ran out into the forest. And he sat in a special place in the forest for 3 days and 3 nights. And he was exhausted. He was uncomfortable. You think these pews are uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable. His back hurt. He was thirsty. He was hungry. Day in and day out, waiting to meet face to face the Lord of death. And after 3 days, the Lord of death did not arrive, but he was greeted by death's 3 assistants: pestilence, famine, and war. And they explained that Lord Yama, which is the name for the Lord of Death, was out collecting rent. And he wouldn't be back for a while, but they'd try to call him back. Well, it took 3 more days before Lord Yama, the Lord of Death, came back. And when he came back, he said, well, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Usually people don't come looking for me. I usually come looking for them, and people run away. But I'll tell you what, since I made you wait an extra 3 days, I will give you 3 blessings. And you can choose those blessings. And so Nachiketa, who had been sitting there contemplating his life and contemplating his death for 6 days out in the wilderness with no food, no water, he sort of had entered what they call in the spiritual traditions this liminal space between the worlds. And he sort of developed a kind of a natural wisdom and an openness. And so when it asked for his first blessing, he told Lord Yama that he wanted his first blessing to be forgiveness. Forgiveness for him, for the things that he'd done in his past, and forgiveness for others like his father. He was particularly thinking about his father. He wanted his father to bless the day that his son was born instead of curse it, and he wanted his father to forgive him, and he wanted to be able to forgive his father for what he'd done and for his shortcomings and his limitations. And so he asked for forgiveness, knowing that he needed to release those issues and problems of his past, knowing that by reconciling all that was incomplete in his heart was the only way for him to enter life and certainly approach his ultimate demise with a sense of hope and possibility and dignity. And so he asked for the blessing of forgiveness, and he was given the blessing of forgiveness. And then, when he was asked about his second blessing, he asked for inner fire, because he knew that to get through this life in a way that he could really feel satisfied and fulfilled about by the time it was over, he needed to find the courage and the ardor and the strength to live his life, to come alive with passion and with a sense of purpose. And that's what he wanted more than anything else. And so he asked that for his second blessing, and he was given the blessing of inner fire, a sense of passion and purpose to come alive in this life that we have. And then, when he came to his third blessing, his last blessing, he asked for what's immortal. And the Lord of Death said, what? You could have anything you want. You could have a whole harem of beautiful maidens that could care for you every day for the rest of your life. He said you could have a golden chariot with the greatest steeds known to mankind. He said, you could have a castle and be a king. Are you sure that you want your last blessing to be something as ethereal and esoteric as knowledge of what's immortal? And Nachiketa said, but all those things, Lord Yama, won't they eventually and quite soon come back to your kingdom, the kingdom of death? And Lord Yama knew he was dealing with a wise, wise soul. And he said, indeed, they will. And so he handed Nachiketa a mirror. And he said, here, take this mirror and look inside. Ask the question, who am I? Who am I really? When this body is gone, when this flesh is no longer, who am I? What am I? Where am I going? Now, over the next 3 weeks, this is a 4-week sermon series that we're starting today, and I'm launching it with this message. We are going to take on all 3 of those blessings more directly. So next Sunday, Tamra is going to talk about the blessing of forgiveness. And then in 2 weeks, I'll come back and I'll be speaking on the topic of inner fire. And then 3 weeks from now, our assistant minister, Barbara Prose, is going to come and talk about what's immortal, the 3 blessings that we need to get through this life and come to the end of our lives with a sense of wholeness and fulfillment and satisfaction and blessing. And so we will be talking about this throughout the month. Now, today's message is about beginning with the end in mind. And Some might ask, why do we talk about death? It's a taboo subject in our culture, and it's not something that we often talk about. The article that I wrote for the Simple Gifts Journal this month is titled, "Talking About Death Won't Kill You." And I took it from the title of a book by that name, and one of the reasons we talk about death and think about our death unafraid to talk about it is because we know that it's the one universal in life. Isn't it interesting that the one thing that we can be certain about, and the only thing that we can be certain about in this life, is the fact that we're going to die and people we love are going to die, and yet it's the one thing that we're most scared to talk about. And so we're talking about it. We're opening it up. We're opening our voices and opening our hearts to this reality, because we know that when we keep the end in mind, it helps us to live our lives. We're not talking about death because we're obsessed with death. It's because we're obsessed with life. And that knowing about our death helps us to live our lives more fully. I want to talk about a meditation that I read about in a book by Stephen Covey. Some of you heard about his bestseller many years ago, back in the 90s, called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he talks about this idea of keeping the end in mind. And in the book, I believe that's where I got this from, he talks about this meditation of, imagine you're at your 90th birthday. Now I realize some of you have already had your 90th birthdays. And I don't see Ruth Stout, who's usually sitting in the front pew, but she's usually here. She's had her 101st birthday already, so I know that Ruth, I don't see you here, but if she comes and she hears this sermon late or hears this sermon later, she might be thinking about something else besides her 90th birthday. But for the rest of us who haven't quite reached that milestone, and if you're already in your 90s, think about your 101st birthday and joining Ruth as a centenarian. Is that what they're called? And so in this, he says, think about your 90th birthday, and you're surrounded by the people who you care about most and who care about you most. And he says, who would those people be? Would it be your children? Would it be your spouse? Would it be a coworker, a friend, a neighbor, somebody who you've helped out volunteering? But think about your roles and think about your relationships, and who would be those people who are surrounding you? And in the meditation, he says, think about what would they say about you? What would you like them to say about you? So for example, if you're a parent, imagining your child saying, my father, my mother came to all my games or all my recitals when I was growing up. Even though he and she were so busy, they made the time, and it meant so much to me and helped me find my passion, and came home in time to help me with my homework. And it wasn't just about homework, but it was that spending time together on a regular basis, and eventually when the books were put away, a lot of times we talked about things that were important to me and that were going on in my life, and I learned so much wisdom from my parent, right? So imagine that child holding up a toast at the 90th birthday. But if we know what we want that child to say when we're 90, it kind of gives us a sense of what we're supposed to do today, right? Because we got to show up at those games and those recitals, and we know, oh, if I want that to be what my child says, then I need to make the time to help with the homework and to do the things that need to be done. Or if we're talking about our spouse, raising a toast and saying how he always or she always expressed her love, bringing flowers or making time for what was important to me. Well, then we know what we need to do today, and at least this week or this month, and we know what to put in our schedule so that when we get to that 90th, 100th birthday, that's what they're saying, right? Our coworkers, someone who respected everybody, respected everyone. Didn't matter if it was the lowest or the highest person in the organization, but always was kind to everyone. And it gives us a sense when we think about the end, about how we want to live today. It's the same with friends. She stayed in touch. She made those calls, especially when it was most important, and came by and brought the cake and brought the food when I needed it. Right? So when we think about keeping the end in mind, we're reminded of what we need to do every day. And I'm always thinking, too, about how the little deaths in our lives, and some of these little deaths are quite big, but the deaths that lead up to our ultimate death, how well we navigate those moments in our lives really sets the course for how well we'll navigate our ultimate death, right? And when I talk about the little deaths, it's a lot of things. It's the death of a relationship, right? Divorce is a kind of death. The loss of a job or the quitting of a job. There's the death of our dreams. When we get to a point we say, I'm never going to, I had to give up. I'm never going to be a rock star. I'm glad you laughed. I was worried. But we give up our dreams of maybe something we thought we were going to do. But those are deaths in our lives. There's so many organizations that we care about and we love, and they end up folding, right? So how we deal with those, and the death of loved ones, of course. How we deal with those deaths sets the course for whether we're going to get to our end with resentment. Do we get to our end and say, you know what? My life stopped. I got divorced and my life stopped. I let it stop. I said I wouldn't be in another relationship ever again. I wore a scowl on my face for the rest of my life because I was done. Or I lost that loved one, my lover, my partner, my wife, my child, my whoever that was. That's it. My life stopped too. Right? When that happens, when we get to the end of our lives, we look back and we say, what was I doing? What was I thinking? I need to work through and find new life in those moments of death. I was really taken by a story of a woman from Arkansas who, when she was 46 years old, her husband, whose name was Gordon, he was diagnosed with very aggressive cancer. And she ended up taking early retirement. And she says that she was so stricken with grief 18 months later when he ultimately died that she felt grief was filling every corner of my soul, she said. I'm 48 and I have no reason to live. She wanted to know, why did God take Gordon when he had so much to offer the world? What do I have? I have nothing. And she was having a hard time getting up in the morning, hard time doing anything, but she got this idea, this concept of beginning with the end in mind, and she wrote out like a pie chart of the different roles that she has in her life. And she had in there wife, it was blank, and she had in there work, and it was blank. She put a question mark. She wasn't sure, and she started to think about what is most important to me, what brings me alive in life, what are those moments and things that have really touched me. And she thought about, for one thing, she thought about the idea of racial harmony, because she's an African American woman and her husband was of another race. I'm not sure which, because it doesn't say in the story, but she said that's been a real important part of my life up to this time, and I hope that there's some way that I can continue to make that an important part of my life. And then she thought about, that's sort of her socially something that's been really important. And then she thought spiritually, and she thought about when she felt the most hope in her life was when her mother, when she was growing up, her mother used to rock critically ill babies. As a volunteer, she'd go to the hospital and she would rock critically ill babies. And she just remembered how much hope that gave her, and she wanted to have something like that in her life. She ended up deciding with some trepidation to go back to school. She was scared. She wasn't sure she could do it, but she figured, I'll quit if I can't do it, and I'll try something else. And she took a whole semester just to learn typing and a computer, because she really didn't know much about those things. And then she went into school. So this is not one of these quick stories that just happens really quickly. She went and got a graduate degree in college, and she ended up getting a job after that teaching at a historically black college in Little Rock, Arkansas. And then after doing that for a couple of years, she was appointed by the governor of Arkansas to be on the Martin Luther King Commission for Racial Harmony. And to this day, once a week, she goes and she rocks crack babies and infants with AIDS who are hooked up to ventilators and machines, and she just once a week goes in and holds them in their arms, knowing that it may be a short relationship and she may not have much time with them, but she wants to give her love, and she says she receives a great deal of love as well. And she says that she can imagine now Gordon looking down on her and smiling, because he said to her before he died that he hoped that she would have a fun life and a fulfilling life. Now, it seems to me that some people, when they lose a loved one, feel like they're dishonoring that person if they allow their life to come alive again in new ways. And in fact, instead of letting the grief become a catalyst for new life, people sometimes will feel that they need to wear their grief as a tribute to the one who's gone. But having sat with many people of many different ages and generations who are dying, I can tell you that one of the greatest fears that they have is that the people they love the most are going to be diminished by the fact that they've died or they're dying. That one of the areas that they often wrestle with on their deathbed of guilt and deep sadness for dying, for failing the people who love them, is sometimes how it feels, is that when they think that their death might hurt the future significantly and even permanently of those who are left behind. We honor the people who we love and we lose when we say yes to life. And the place to begin is at the end, because the end is often the beginning, and the beginning is often the end. So may we be a community who live and love with the end in mind. And may we work our way back to a life that truly matters. I love you. Amen.